Hey, everybody, you are watching and listening to the We Are Rizin podcast. This is your host, Andrew Benjamin. I am joined by my co-host, Jay Christian Gary, from all the way down in Houston or near Houston, Texas.
Yes, you can say near Houston, Texas, since I'm like 45 minutes south from it, as this is also not just a special episode of the We Are Rising podcast, but if you're listening to this on the audio format, this is a special episode of Focus Fights Audio, as well as we are here to honor the life, the legacy, and the memories of one Antonio Kanji Inoki, who passed away at the age of 79. I think over the weekend, if not on Monday. No, wait, actually, it was definitely over the weekend, but his memory is still felt that it felt like he passed away yesterday. But still, here to talk about this whole thing with us is the author of one of the books about the impact that Antonio Inoki and by extension Muhammad Ali and Judo Jean LaBelle, who we also lost in the combat sports world over the last couple of months. The impact that all three of those men had, is acclaimed mixed martial arts writer, acclaimed combat sports fan, and, a man on a certain Bald Fathers band list that we don't want to talk about, but we know he wants to just enjoy the fruits of the combat sports labor. He is at Ye_Ye on Twitter. This is Josh Gross. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Christian. How are you guys doing? What's up, Andrew?
Hey, Josh, thank you so much. And also, by the way, as well, great piece that you did on Pitbull for his fight this past weekend as well.
I appreciate that. I don't write as much as I used to, but when I do, I appreciate hearing stuff like that. Thank you.
Is it, what they say, one of the things about MMA now is that we humanize fighters now. That's a big angle, and you certainly made Patricio, excuse me, much more like learning about his life and all that stuff.
Interesting. I'll just say quickly on that, like one of the first interviews I ever remember in my career, like meeting, like was Pat Miletich, and he, this was 2000, and he shared like his entire life story with me and like really intimate stuff, and I was blown away that fighters would do that. And so I think the idea of humanizing is, telling their stories and understanding them has always been important and always been there. But if that's a trend now, I think that's probably a good thing.
And speaking of life stories, death and all that, like Christian said, Antonio Inoki passed away this week. I gotta say, kind of like the Queen, kind of like some other like people. I always just thought, when I heard about his death, I was kind of like, I can't believe it. This is like the end of an era, because ever since I was a kid, since Christian was a kid, I'm sure since you were a kid, Josh, Inoki's always just been around, and now he's not. What was your thoughts when you first heard about that he had passed away?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say he's an icon and a legend. I mean, legend is a word that gets thrown around way too much, but it applies to Antonio Inoki. I mean, I don't think you can argue. Like, no one would have a good argument to say he's not a legend. Well, if he's not a legend, who is really? And I think comparing him sort of the Queen, the impact we felt to people around the world, or Muhammad Ali, I think is fair to say. I got to be honest, I didn't know who Antonio Inoki was until I started covering Japanese MMA and learning about Japanese MMA. I grew up really not paying too close attention to pro wrestling. I mean, when I was a young kid, like Ricky the Steamboat Dragon and Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, I knew, but I was much more of a sports fan, diehard sports fan. Dodgers were my life, the Raiders, that kind of stuff. And I played sports. And so I didn't really get a sense for who Antonio Inoki was in the world until I was around him covering Pride events and things like that. And at that point, he was already like older, where you knew that this was someone who had lived a life. And quickly you learn that he was the guy who had the match with Muhammad Ali. And, that in Japanese pro wrestling circles, he was incredibly important. And so I didn't really respect that until I went and started researching and writing the book and talking to the people who were around him and the legacy he had. And so I definitely developed much more of an appreciation for Antonio Inoki in that process. And I think no matter how you got to know who he was, you remembered him. He was like one of these charismatic people that you come across in life, celebrity, for one reason or another, he sticks to you. Him and Muhammad Ali had very similar qualities in terms of their charisma and the way crowds reacted to them and how much they felt comfortable in that attention. And I think that's one of the reasons why they connected so strongly too, because they could identify with one another that way. But he's definitely a people that you can talk about for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, he lived a life, so there's certainly a lot to critique and say, mistake here. Why did he do this? Oh, he definitely had his foibles. There's no doubt this was not a perfect human being by any stretch of the imagination. But he lives an unbelievable life that I think people are rightly remembering.
And if you think about that unbelievable life outside of combat sports, I mean, I hate to sound like Chris Collinsworth, but here's a guy who outside of combat sports had basically diplomatic relations with North Korea long before Dennis Rodman was even hanging up the basketball shoes. He led a whole delegation of Japanese detainees out of Iraq. He was basically a member of the Japanese parliament while he was winding down his wrestling career. But in a way, do you think that outside influence, do you think that all the stuff that Inoki did outside of combat sports, and this also includes, his work after, him versus Ali with Judo Gene LaBelle as the referee, do you think that those outside influences, help make him more known in the Western world?
The impact of the Ali match, you're saying?
Well, not just that, but also what he's managed to do away from competition.
Oh, yeah. Well, certainly, I don't think he would have been able to do much of that had he not sought to make a name for himself and then really connect with Ali. Because I think he had a name for himself in Japan and through Asia. Obviously, he came up wrestling with Ricky Dozan, who was like really the godfather of Japanese pro wrestling, right? So that's a guy who picked out Antonio Inoki. He saw him, the story goes, saw him in Brazil. Inoki's family was in Brazil, and really big physical guy working in the plantations, whatnot, wrestling, competing, a great athlete, track and field, that sort of stuff. Ricky Dozan found him, brought him over. Antonio Inoki learned how to really, what the crowd wanted, what they loved, how you interacted with them. What was it like to be a giant star and live in that life? Because Ricky Dozan, brought him up. So there's a lot of reasons why Inoki gained fame and notoriety. He was also very sort of, again, coveting that. Like, this was one of the reasons that I think people will point to his mistakes or his decision making and not understand it, or say like, oh, he turned his back on some people, because Antonio Inoki was about himself. And sometimes that desire to be the man and sort of drive everything forward would mean he had to step on other people. It just, and I don't, look, this is a guy who was so universal through Japanese culture. When I was going to Japan in the early 2000s, you'd walk around Tokyo and you'd see there's these gambling parlors and the pachinko machines with Inoki on them, and they'd advertise it. This is who he was. So I think his influence extends in a lot of different ways because he was so intent on representing pro wrestling as a martial art. It brought him into a world that has its own history, right? Martial arts on its own is vast and important. And so he was crossing streams in a lot of ways, and he could see the benefit of that. And then roping in someone like Ali, who through just his presence in the world, who he was, the way he spoke, what he represented, who he was at that time. Remember in 1976, Ali was, outside the Pope, the most famous man in the world. So, Inoki was smart enough, crafty enough, and really understood what he represented to people. And I think his influence extends 100 different ways because of it. And anything he touched, one way or another, is the sum of Antonio Inoki, because I think you can't really pick out one thing or another and say that defines who he was.
Right.
And so actually going on about that, being this cult of personality, also the way he conducted himself outside, like you said, like he had his own gimmick. He always went around with a red towel or red scarves anywhere. He always seemed to be always in a suit and tie, or at least dressed up very nice. He had his own catchphrase that he would do for everything, Ich ni san da, It makes sense. Same thing that Ali did. I'm the greatest. A lot of similarities, but also it just shows that pro wrestling, as they didn't just that he didn't just live his pro wrestling gimmick in the ring. He took it with him outside the ring into every venture that he did, whether it was politics, pachinko machines, all that stuff. And so when you were researching this guy, this guy, Josh, were you fascinated by this guy who just seemed to be living almost, as they say, living the gimmick, as they say?
Yeah, it was the gimmick because he lived in the pro wrestling world. And if you live in that world, you're living a gimmick. It's almost like it's really hard to separate the character you play from who you are in real life. Because once you let that down, you're letting people behind the curtain, right? And it's got to be kayfabe and the whole thing. And again, sort of like I learned about this stuff as it went. I didn't end up like all interested in pro wrestling after the project or whatever it was. I'm just aware of the space and how it works. But that wasn't just the driving factor with him. It was also like, I'm a sportsman too. And so it's like that combination of things allowed it to be more than a gimmick. He used the smart pro wrestling gimmicky side, as did Ali, by the way. Like Ali learned that stuff from pro wrestlers in the early 1960s in Los Angeles. He was a huge fan of a pro wrestler named Gorgeous George, who in LA made his name at the Grand Olympic Auditorium that Ali fought at three times in '62. So that connection was Gene LaBelle. And Gene LaBelle, he was like the middle of the match. That tied everything together. And it was sort of that pro wrestling / real world. I'm going to carry all of that together. And what people are going to see is a character, but it's me. I think that all sort of fit together for all three of those guys. That you can really let it ever go. It became who you were because you couldn't let it go. But there were also many, many other layers and dimensions to who they were that we may not have seen all the time. But certainly Inoki played that role and played that character. I mean, I saw him in all sorts of different environments. I was around him in official capacity, like press conferences or like after parties where like at Pride. I saw him in the gym working out. I was around Inoki in a lot of different ways. I interviewed him multiple times. I interviewed him in Little Tokyo in downtown Los Angeles. He came for an event. And I was the first time I'd ever seen him slap people who were lined up to be slapped. It was like, and I didn't really, when it was the end of him speaking and people started to get up in line, like someone tipped me off. It's like, this is where he like starts slapping people. I was like, what is happening? And he did it. And I understood it was like him inferring his energy onto these people. It was weird, but at the same time, by the third or fourth or fifth time I'd seen it, you get it's part of like this ritual, who he is as a pro wrestler, what he represents, this sort of fighting spirit. He's got so much fighting spirit that he can put it in your body and your soul. And that's Antonio Inoki. And I think, he lived his life with so much energy. It's like almost impossible to comprehend. But that's I don't think you could really separate what the character was from the man was at a certain point. They're the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? That basically leads me to wonder, when it comes down to him slapping all these people, I think I remember in a distinct, instance. Sorry about that. I think I remember in a distinct instance, it was at Inoki Bombaye 2000, New Year's Eve 2000. He was in the ring and a whole line of people from the entranceway onto the ring was basically getting, I guess, the hand of God, so to speak, by Antonio Inoki. They were basically lining up to get bitch slapped, so to speak.
Everybody you're just the regular ticket holder, or you were the promoter of the event, or you were another pro wrestler or another fighter, they all lined up. Quentin Jackson lined up. Quentin Jackson's like, I will let that man slap me. I've never let no man slap me before. That's what Quentin Jackson told me about. So, everybody.
I gotta ask. So, Josh, you said you really got me interested in saying that you met him. I gotta ask, what was it like meeting Antonio Inoki? Like, did you what was the interaction? Like, what was it like meeting him?
I mean, one of the things that I've, for better or for worse, whatever, it's just the way I've always gone about it, is that like when I meet someone for an interview, it doesn't matter who they are. There's someone I'm talking to for an interview. and I give them the sort of the respect of just like they're a person, a human being in the world. But like I've never felt like to overly acknowledge what they've done, who they are. You know, we're having an exchange and like has to sort of be very real. So I treated him like everybody else that I've ever talked to, just like a person in the world. And you know, I would say that there were certain times where he was willing to speak a little bit more times than others. Sometimes he was the character. Sometimes he would let his guard down. But I saw him in all sorts of different ways. He was always a mystery man, no matter what. I mean, you know, he was always someone that you never, like with most pro wrestlers I dealt with, like you never quite were sure what you were getting, how much of it was real, how much of he is saying because he's working some angle on you or whatever it was. And believe me, I've had like pro wrestlers work that angles on me before I even knew to look at it. So, you know, he was, everybody was sort of looking at him, focused on him. And when he said something funny, everybody laughed. You know, he was one of those guys where everybody in the room around him interacted to like based on him. He gave the cues on how to be and how to act. I never got the sense that he didn't want to be there talking to me. And, you know, I just knew that like when I got done with the interview, it was like, oh, I just interviewed Antonio Inoki. That's cool. You know, that's like, yeah, that's how I felt about it. And, you know, then tried to find, you know, what the story was and put something together.
When you were also researching and learning about his pro wrestling career and his, I guess his attempt to kind of meld MMA and pro wrestling later in life, what did you think about like they call it Inokiism, and I know it had the spans, for better or for worse, but I mean, what did you think about like after the fact? So after Ali, and his fight happened, now he tried to seemingly meld the pro wrestling world and MMA worlds. And what are your thoughts on like on him trying to marry those two worlds together?
Yeah, I think he tried to manufacture that. He fought a lot of like other people from other combat sports, karate guys, judo players, like high level Olympians kind of stuff. Most of it was worked, but it was in an effort to prove that pro wrestling was a real art and that he was the king of the pro wrestlers, right? So that was his deal. But I think later in life, a lot of people criticized him when he would throw pro wrestlers that were under his federations or into mixed martial arts fights, and they got trashed, and they could, for a while, it made the pro wrestlers look weak in terms of my understanding of how the public interacted with that, and a lot of the Japanese pro wrestling media that was covering it. And so he drew criticism for that. But I think a lot of it to me was, you know, this trial under fire Bushido thing that is the main current that runs through Japanese fight sports. And Inoki had to like engage with that to make what they were doing real. And if it meant like his guys got trashed, well, they got trashed, but he didn't get trashed. So it also made him look better. You know, I think with a lot of things, everything Inoki did, it like there's this element of like, how did it benefit him? And for most highly successful people in the world, there's going to be that. But I think it's important to understand the moves that he made or sanctioned or put his guys into that, you know, made them look bad or weak. You know, part of it, and this is my sort of guessing game on it, is that, you know, it also made what he had accomplished in life, what he had done, sort of all the more impressive, relatively speaking. And I don't think that it'd be incorrect of me to guess like something that was part of the calculation of why some of those guys were thrown in and why some of the criticism came, you know, later. He also wasn't averse to criticism. He didn't care. He was a guy that basically said, no matter what happens, I will come out okay on the other side. Even if it sounds like the worst scenario in the world, I will come out on the other side. And, you know, a lot of that was filtered into the calculus of how he did things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And actually, I'll start branch off that with this question that we have from a listener from the Discord, Rizin MMA Discord, from Czar Boris. He wants to know: do you think Inoki could have actually succeeded in the MMA business during the boom period, or do you think Pride and K1 had pretty much cemented their place as market leaders and no one was going to compete with them?
You mean like as a promoter? Like if
yeah.
he just,
oh yeah, because I also
with Pride and he went out and like 100% did his own thing from the beginning, kind of thing.
Because I know that New Japan, that when he was president of New Japan during that time, he did feature kickboxing and MMA bouts during the pro wrestling thing. But yeah, do you think that had he gone full MMA or kickboxing, you think he could have competed with Pride? Based, I'm Antonio Inoki, I'm the promoter. Come see my show.
I think the fact that he didn't really do that kind of answers the question. Because if he felt like he could go off on his own and sort of own the space, he was always that way. Like that was always his energy to be the leader, to jump out in front. I think he wasn't the best businessman. And, that may have gotten in the way of it. Plus, there was a lot of competition, probably more competition in the combat sports space at that time than there was in pro wrestling, certainly for an Antonio Inoki. So I think he decided to continue to leverage that side of the space by aligning with it. He was part of Pride events as sort of a brand ambassador for a while. And that was more comfortable for him. It's an interesting question. I think if he had decided to do that before, even before the early beginnings of Shuto and, Tiger Mask sort of really taking it to the next level of like pro wrestling as a martial art, if Inoki had done something in the wake of the Ali match, maybe, except that it was just so ill received that it was kind of like he couldn't capitalize as much, I'm sure, as he wanted to based on how people felt about that result. And so maybe it took a little time for him to feel comfortably to get back in that space. I don't know. Far be it from me to say that no, Antonio Inoki couldn't have done that. I think the way that played out is probably the way it would have played out best for him. And like sort of, thinking about his connections, he was at certain periods really important in what Pride was doing, and at other periods pushed to the side and they didn't want him around. And I think that also was sort of the natural course of how it worked with whatever Inoki was kind of affiliated with.
Oh, Chris, go ahead. Did you have a question?
True. But I also, wanted to say on this, Andrew did mention that, New Japan Pro Wrestling had kickboxing fights, had obviously mixed martial arts fights or matches with the likes of Lyoto the Dragon Machida. Hell, if it wasn't for Antonio Inoki, who the hell would have really have heard of a guy by the name of Lyoto the Dragon Machida in anywhere, the UFC, Bellator, what have you? But you also have to think about it. This dude had amateur wrestlers from Russia and Mongolia under his employ. He also had Muay Thai fighters under his employ. Ultimate fighters like Brian Johnson and Don Fry under his employ. See where I'm going with this? He basically blended some of those fighters who would normally be traditional in their respective sports, MMA, kickboxing, Muay Thai, into being a top fighter and a top wrestler really for his promotion. Wouldn't you agree with that, Josh?
Yeah, I think that all goes into exactly what he was trying to accomplish, right? He wanted pro wrestling to be considered not only a martial art, but the best martial art. And so he was always mixing with these different styles. I think for different reasons. One, he actually, a lot of the submission holds we see in catch wrestling, which is what Karl Gotch did, which is who taught Antonio Inoki most of this stuff, right? A lot of that lineage is real. When there was mixed fights in the 1930s and the 1920s and the 1910s, it was like this catch wrestling, literally the kind of stuff that Antonio Inoki learned. So trying to test it against other martial arts made total sense. It was totally valid. And then bringing in those other martial arts to interact with more of the pro wrestling side, the fun side, the work side makes sense. It all sort of intertwines it. And I think that's really what his vision was. It was well-intentioned. It wasn't, it wasn't a thing where I think like he was trying to fool anyone. I think he recognized people were smart enough to know the difference of when it was real, when it wasn't real. But keeping them intertwined was crucial to him. And that's why I think that's really inseparable, right? And that's why I think the Ali Inoki match itself is sort of a seminal event in this timeline of this collection of MMA, pro wrestling, and boxing at the time, but really pro wrestling and combat sports. For for a long time, like I thought, oh, the connection was really, I didn't understand it because I grew up with like the WWF version of what pro wrestling was. So to me, it didn't look anything like sports or Olympic wrestling or whatever. But the more I learned about the kind of wrestling they did in Japan and had that filtered over into Shudo and Pancrase, literally, you know, these kinds of matches, I was like, you can't, it's intertwined forever. You can't separate it. If you're trying to say there's walls between them, that your argument fails. So Inoki was absolutely a driver of that. No question of it.
Exactly. And, you know, the one thing I want to ask when it comes down to this, before I pass it back to Andrew and see if he has more Discord questions, is this dude basically helped make the, you know, big mega events, whether it be New Year's Eve or January 4th, really possible, because he had these events that, you know, either sold out a smaller, like 10 or 15,000 seat arena on New Year's Eve, or sold out big stadiums on New Year's Eve, or even sold out the damn Tokyo Dome on January 4th, help make that place a damn hotspot for New Japan Pro Wrestling, you know, just off of his presence. But do you feel that, you know, when it comes to Antonio Inoki, we really have him to thank for these big mega events that sell out arenas, sell out stadiums all over the world?
I wouldn't thank him alone, but he's definitely among the elite people who have sold tickets, created interest, drawn media attention, been able to convince the public that what he's doing matters in a large way. And certainly, I mean, look, I mean, you guys are having me on because of one of those events, right? Certainly Inoki's history is larger than just the Ali match, but the Ali match was a significant event. It really, go ahead.
I mean, in a way, you could basically say that the Ali Inoki match, which obviously had closed circuit undercards, especially in New York at Shea Stadium with Andre the Giant versus Chuck Wepner, the original Rocky, by the way. You know, you could basically say cards like that helped lead to the true launch of, you know, the model we now know officially as pay-per-view, or in the WWE's case, premium live events. But yeah, well, you can basically thank the Inoki Ali fight for launching closed circuit TV, which led to pay-per-views. Wouldn't you agree with that as well?
Well, there's been a closed circuit before this, but it was definitely a piece of that. No doubt about it. You know, I don't know if my book, right? So if you can read the caption there, the forgotten fight that inspired mixed martial arts and launched sports entertainment, right? So I really feel like this was a kicking off point for what we consider sports entertainment, which is essentially whatever pro wrestling has become today. And also these crossover bouts that we see, like Mayweather and McGregor or Jake Paul. I think it's all sort of the same bucket in terms of creating public interest in a combat sports umbrella event. It's got elements of the show, of the pro wrestling. It's got elements of the competition, the sport, whatever the combat sport is we're dealing with. I think Ali versus Inoki was worthy of being a book because there was so much that led to it in terms of combat sports history, the event itself, and then everything that branched off afterwards. And I don't think that you can separate what sports entertainment looks like today, how fans interact with it, what the combination is between pro wrestling and martial arts and mixed martial arts, because that still exists, right? I don't watch much WWE, but like, isn't Daniel Cormier now reffing some match?
Right? Daniel Cormier, surprise, surprise, he will be refereeing something called the Fight Pit between Matt Riddle, former UFC fighter, and Seth freaking Rollins this weekend.
And it sounds a lot to me like right out of what we're talking about.
Yeah, of
combat
course.
Sports, mixed martial arts, pro wrestling mesh. Look, if you want to talk about WWE, Vince McMahon, his father, and the son who just retired, Ali Inoki does not happen without them. So, you know, it all sort of works together. And, I do think Antonio Inoki was a major player in the long art of pro wrestling and combat sports, and a very, very important character whose legacy I think will always be remembered. Obviously, not in the way that an Ali would, nor should it be, I think, but for some people in the world, he's as big a star, as famous, as important, and you can understand that. I think, in some respects, isn't he? He's, Ali, Antonio Inoki's a WWE Hall of Famer, right? I mean, it's like, it's impossible to separate him out, the combat sports side. And I think that's 100% reason why you just said what you said, Christian, is that to me, the way that I put the subhead on the book was that, yeah, this event, if you look at it and you look at all the branches that came off of it, this was kind of really like the point where everything had been building towards what sports entertainment could be. And if you look at Vince McMahon Jr., his motivations, I mean, literally he was involved in this event and he saw himself attaching to Ali and attaching to Inoki and saying, this is the global pro wrestling experience that I want to have and build. And for a lot of people, I think this was a seminal event.
We got some more questions from the Discord. This one kind of gives away the book in a way, but I'll still ask it anyway.
It's been out since 2016, man. Give this shit away. It's all good.
Did Inoki out Carney Ali and trick him into a real contest when it was supposed to be a work?
Man, we're jumping through hoop after hoop after hoop trying to figure that out.
I've heard everything that that it was a work, but then it turned into a shoot. That it was actually work, but then
it was initially proposed by the McMahons as a work. Mm-hmm. And Ali said, no way am I laying down for anyone. I'm not doing that. Mm-hmm. And then no one really knew what it was. Mm-hmm. Ali was promoting it with pro wrestlers. He was on ABC Wide World of Sports doing pro wrestling. It was clear. But then he'd go on the Tonight Show and say, this is 100% real. I wouldn't fool anybody. This is a real fight. Mm-hmm. And then he got to Japan and no one really knew what it was. Everybody kind of thought it was a joke. But then Inoki's people started, and Inoki were like, no, this is serious. Like, I know how to break your arm if it comes to that. And so the negotiations on rules got serious the week of the fight. And, it basically came down to no one trusts one another. And we're going to all kind of say this is real. And there's some protections, like you can grab a rope or you can't do this, you can't do that. But yeah, I mean, look, I think it was weird, but awesomely weird. It was real, but at the same time, it was so structured and walled off that it's hard to call it like a real fight. But it was. Inoki kicked him in the leg over 100 times. Ali got blood clots because of it in his leg. He'd never been kicked in the leg like that before. So I think if we look like if these two guys got matched up in a real MMA fight, it would look like a real MMA fight, not like a worked old pancreas fight. Mm-hmm. I think Ali wouldn't have allowed that. Ali was too much of a competitor. He wanted it too bad. He asked for this. He always wanted to fight a wrestler. He always wanted to be in something legitimate. He understood the history of boxers fighting grapplers. That's a real history, not a pro wrestling history. He wanted to be part of that. So, I think in the end, everybody got nervous and treated it like a real fight, and that's why it looked the way it did.
I think that's also still kind of why the appeal of it still lasts to this day, because we still don't know the exactly what happened. And it's kind of like I almost don't want to know, kind of like learning about how the sausage is made. Kind of the mystery behind it, I think, is what helps sustains it pretty well.
Yeah, look at the characters and the weirdness of it, and the pro wrestling ties will always sort of cloud that. But I feel like I have a good enough sense to know that what it was supposed to be, what it really wasn't, and what it turned into. And for me, the lasting impact is that it was sporting enough that there's a sports legacy to it, and that's how I sort of view the lasting impact, because it created a new genre. In a lot of ways, a new genre of fighting. A lot of people saw that and their imaginations peaked. You saw a lot of more mixed style fighting coming up in North America after that, way before the UFC. And so, I think that's where the roots and the genesis have a real lasting impact for me in my perspective. Yeah.
And we have one more question in the Discord, and that's from Sar Boris as well. And he wants to know, I don't know if you know the answer to this. If you don't, that's totally fine. What did Giant Baba, Antonio Inoki's rival at All Japan, think about Ali versus Inoki? I don't know if you happen to know the answer to that.
I don't think I have an answer for that. I'd have to look up honestly when he passed away. It may have been later. He was older than Inoki. And I didn't spend a lot of time. I wrote a little bit about him, but more about like sort of Inoki's motivation, but not even that. It's more like just his desire and sort of what that meant in terms of the relationship and how he split off and did his own thing and didn't really care about relationships. So I'm not sure what he thought. I mean, I could only guess, but I'd only be guessing. And I prefer not to do that.
And they also probably nobody might even know because, like they said, they kept kayfabe very strict. So Giant Baba may have taken his opinion of him to the grave for all we know. Also, just want to say as well that the Inoki Al-Karni Ali question was from King Silo 24, one of our favorites.
I just want to say that Giant Baba passed away in 1999. So I look stupid that I didn't know that, but that's okay. It's okay to look stupid sometimes. I would say that I guess it wasn't important enough for me to chase down and really look what he thought of it at the time. They had been long split. Inoki was off, established New Japan Pro Wrestling, was off, did his own thing. And to me, that branch of it, really, Ricky Dozan was a much more interesting character in terms of the Japanese pro wrestling world. As far as I was concerned, I spent more time on him than Giant Baba. And
the last question I have for you, Josh, is, Inoki was one of a kind. Do you think that we'll ever see, not just Japan, maybe in America, or maybe there's somebody who there is now who is, and you can say their name, but if there isn't, do you think we'll ever get somebody like Inoki ever again, who's just this ubiquitous presence, celebrity, someone who's in sports, television, all this stuff, and who just has such an impact on almost everything culturally? Do you think we'll ever get somebody like that ever again?
Right. So it's that last part of it that makes me hesitate, right? So these guys, these men and women, and we're talking about really Ali and Inoki, right?
Yeah.
They had such an enormous effect culturally on the people around him, the time and the space. That seems like a much more difficult thing in this day and age, where becoming a celebrity is not that hard. It's almost like in its own industry now, industry of celebrity. So the value of it's a lot less, and the social impact. I mean, Ali's social impact is incredibly well documented and understood, right? And then Inoki, culturally speaking, is a celebrity, is sort of a figure within Japan and parts of Asia, and then what he did politically and some of the things you referenced earlier. I mean, it's hard to imagine characters like that coming along too often. I never say never. There are going to be people who are incredibly important and charismatic in moving forward, whether it's in our lifetimes or not. But there are going to be people like this because special people emerge that make an impact on the rest of us. So I don't want to say no, but it's hard to imagine. It'll be something that I probably haven't considered yet in a way that they affect the world or do something that none of us have really thought of or imagined. How many people in their early 70s were thinking about, creating a sport of mixed fighting? Gene LaBelle had to fight in the 60s, but, it was very fleeting. It wasn't like a thing. There wasn't a community around it. There wasn't huge interest around it. Now it's a globally known thing, in part because of guys like Inoki's contributions and obviously Ali's small piece of it. But I'm just going to say, yeah, but having no idea where they come from, and also acknowledging that it seems like it's a lot less likely, right? But there are going to be people as ambitious as Antonio Inoki, and they may leave an impact, and if they leave one for the better, I mean, I hope they exist. Both these people made a huge impression on a lot of us, and I'd say for the most part, the impressions were positive and things that we think fondly of and remember well, and see their contributions as like meaningful, right? That's why the question was asked. So I'm just going to leave it at like, I hope so. I think they're rare. And when they do come along, we'll know. We'll know and we'll see that. But I think there's not too many people like them. And, it's important to remember that and sit in that and recognize that this one moment, this one night in their lives, right, that we're still talking about, we could probably talk about for another 10 hours or whatever. I wrote a whole damn book about it. People make videos and talk about it. All these sorts of things. There's a blip in the radar for what they did and what their lives look like, there's not a lot of people who come along you can say that about, but hopefully they will, and I look forward to seeing it in my life if they do.
Understood. And my last question is an interpretation on what that guy asked on Discord. And in a way, it has to, admit that Inoki was 79 years old when he passed away this past week. And it kind of makes you think, about the impact that he had, obviously. But let's just say if he were like 10 or 20 years younger, do you think that Inoki's impact would have still been lasting to the point where, in a way, he would have potentially saved, not just Japanese mixed martial arts, but Japanese combat sports, maybe even, in some little trinkets, Japanese sports in general?
I don't think so, because 20 years ago I was around him. And, I saw the kind of character he was and the baggage that came with him. And, again, I sort of alluded to, maybe not the best businessman. I don't know. That's sort of along the lines of the last one in terms of like, legacy and what people accomplished and when they accomplished it. I think his impact was enormous on the industry that we know today. I happen to think that the Japanese mixed martial arts business is doing all right. I wouldn't consider it dead. I think if you're talking about it that way, you're missing a lot. I do think that there are complications in Japan that you don't see in other parts of the world that are uniquely Japanese. Part of that obviously affected what Pride ended up, them going under and the UFC buying them. I don't know that any of that would have changed if Inoki, maybe if he was a better businessman or, his motivations were different. But this was a guy who I think was about pushing boundaries. And maybe that's why, he wasn't suited for being the guy who was going to be the main, chief executive behind running the successful business that became like the UFC or something. I think he was much more of a big thinker, kind of imaginative guy, almost a creative as opposed to a businessman. And, his influence was based on the things that he did create, really. Mm-hmm. And a few of them were businesses, but they were always troubled. So no, I'm going to say no. I think that the course of the Japanese MMA business got as big as it did during the periods it did, in large part, because of Inoki. When you sell out National Stadium and there's 90,000 people and he skydives in and they go ape shit over it, like that's Antonio Inoki, right? And I think part of that is because he had this fight with Muhammad Ali. How many people are going to say that they had a fight with Muhammad Ali where Muhammad Ali did mixed rules and he didn't do boxing? One guy. And that was Antonio Inoki, who dedicated his life to making events like this. And I think his contributions were as big and as great as they were. And for anyone to sort of sit back and think, well, what could have been or what he could have done, man, look at what he did. Just look at what he did, and let's think about that. And there's enough to focus on there and say the legacy is pretty damn impactful. And if the Japanese MMA business faltered along the way, that's not his problem necessarily. I would lay that much more at the feet of promoters who ran afoul of tax interests in Japan. Master Ishii had tax issues, and that's why K1 suffered, right? And then, Saki Kibara had issues, obviously, and DSE had issues with organized crime in Japan. Those were decisions they made. And I don't lay that at the feet of, what Inoki could have done, because he did a lot. And, he lent his name and likeness and obviously got embroiled, and he was far from perfect too. He definitely had his warts. So I gotta say, like, I feel a lot more bullish on Japanese MMA today than I did 5 years ago when I wrote a piece about does Japanese MMA need Sakakibara, not Inoki? Because I think Sakakibara ends up being I'm not going to say more important than Antonio Inoki, but much different in terms of having the business function in a way that matters in Japan and matters internationally. And I think there's no debate, and maybe I'm sort of just like rambling here, but I want to finish with this, that like, there's no debate that the talent coming out of Japan is much better now than it was 5 years ago. When you talk about the level of competition for them against, or to consider the best internationally, right? I think you're seeing the products of fighters being built in Japan go off and win championships in the UFC, and they're different kinds of fighters. Jerry Prochaska is a different kind of fighter, and he's different because he came out of Rizin. And all that tradition that followed him, and sort of the martial arts and the different way of thinking about it, and the fanfare and the flair and all that sort of stuff mattered with who he ends up being as a fighter. And I think all the people who come out of Japan, any fighter who sort of embraces that or feels that, some small piece of them is also Antonio Inoki.
But I know you, Josh, you got to head out. But before you go, I just want to give an opportunity for you to plug everything you're doing for SureDog. Plug, of course, your book and anything else that you want to give. Anything you want to shout out to.
Thank you. I'm probably not doing as much for SureDog as I should be doing, but I think just check out their stuff regardless. It's an important independent MMA website. I like to see people look at it and check out the stuff that's going on there. The book you can find on Amazon, or you can get the publisher. The link is in my Twitter profile. And I'm still watching some combat sports. I'm also covering a lot of soccer. So, different world entirely, man. And it also sort of makes me realize how unique combat sports is because of the characters like we talked about today. It never really gets boring, I got to say.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, when you are as much of a fan of combat sports as Andrew and I are, you never get tired of this stuff.
Well, that's good to hear. I haven't considered myself a fan for a long time because I won't let myself be a fan. But like, I understand that because I started as a fan. I watched it as a fan. I appreciate it as a fan. And then like journalism ruined all of that for me. But I accept that. And that's like part of the price. So I'm all right.
Yeah, but man, continue with what you're doing. Inoki, Ali versus Inoki is a great book. I read it when it came out. I'm going to have to do another reread of it now with the passing of Inoki. And who knows, maybe 20 years from now, you'll be writing about Paul versus Silva. Who knows?
Oh, no. Andrew, don't even give him that idea.
That doesn't sound as crazy as you would think, unfortunately.
I mean, come to think of it, it would be even worse if you were to do a story or do a book about Mayweather versus Asakura. Come on, man.
Or whatever weird thing. But no, Josh, we really appreciate your time. Thank you for telling us about all the Inoki. Sorry. Quick question. Did you get slapped by Inoki when you met him? I gotta know.
Never slapped by Inoki.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Never slapped by Inoki.
Okay. But yeah.
And you know what? One more thing we can go ahead and say, quick plug. You can follow Josh Gross on Twitter at @yay_ye. Is that correct, Josh?
That's it. That's it.
Great. And make sure to get your copy of Ali vs. Inoki at your local bookstore. If you happen to be near a bookstore, Amazon, Kindle, or whatever, the publisher, direct from the publisher. And yes, thank you again, Josh.
You know what? Basically, what you're saying, Andrew, is if you get Josh Gross's book, buy it legally. Yes. Buy it any place where you can get the book legally, either at a brick and mortar store, if there's still one, or online. That's all we got to say about that.
Man, don't pirate my book, please. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you again, Josh. We really appreciate the time, man. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, guys.